Ecological restoration, regenerative design, those words sound great, just what we need. But what do they mean in practice? In this series of interviews, I talk to pioneers who are doing regenerative design to find out what their work entails in the real world. The format is simple. I ask each guest to talk us through 3 or 4 projects, and then we'll discuss how did they get started with the project, who did they connect with, and how did they do that, what did they discover along the way, what were the outcomes of the project, and looking ahead, what kind of lessons will they use going forwards. But we want to keep these conversations informal, so I'm very thrilled to have with me today Henriette Waal, who was trained as a designer and now works as an artist, researcher, and an art director. And in locations from the north of Europe to North Africa, her work connects the worlds of design, ecology, and community. And as we'll see in a moment when she takes us through some projects. Since 2013, Henriette has led the Social Design Master Program at Design Academy Eindhoven in the Netherlands. And in 2016, she helped to initiate Atelier Luma, an experimental design laboratory not far from where I am here in France, in the Camargue bioregion in Arles. And at Atelier Luma, Henriette Waal is currently leading fieldwork research across Mediterranean wetlands. So that's a very short summary of her work, but I've put some links in the text below this video, so you can read in lots of directions from there. But right now, welcome Henriette. Thanks for joining me. And let's just jump in and tell us what we're looking at in this first slide.
Well, thank you, John, for the great introduction. It was very hard for me to choose one slide of Atelier Luma, but I was very much triggered by your question to talk about how things started. So I looked back into my archive and chose these images. They're more from the beginning of the atelier. It's well, like you said, it's a design research lab in the south of France, in right next to the Camargue, which is a wetland of international importance. And I co-initiated this this lab, which is a program of the Luma Foundation, which is this big cultural site in Arles. And yeah, these, like, actually, let's talk from the images.
Yep.
What we see on the left is an image from in the Camargue from a masterclass on living with rising water that I organized together with 5 different architecture schools around the Mediterranean, and to position the Luma Foundation as a place where this problematic that was so far ignored in this region could be discussed and explored from the field of architecture. Then on the right, above, on the right, top right, you see me picking up for the first time some salt in the salins, because the Camargue, they have wetland nature, but they also have salt marshes and a former salt industry. So this is actually the moment where the idea to study salt and to understand salt and to find new valorizations for this material was born. And on the bottom, you see a photo from my friend and colleague Erik Klarenbeek, with whom I invited in this project, and with whom I'm visiting a local biologist and her husband, a photographer, and we were looking at some bacterial effects that this man photographed, which actually was the start of working with the kind of invisible biodiversity as part of Atelier Luma. And yeah, apart from explaining the pictures, I thought about a text on the very beginning that author and cultural theorist Elke Krasny wrote. It was a conversation I had with her, and she wrote it down. And because you and I had this conversation, I revisited that text that never made it into any Luma publication. And I wanted to read something, a short piece from that text. The story in the Camargue of Atelier Luma begins with the flamingos. What is important to know is that actually all started with the fascination for flamingos. I can still remember, so it's me talking, I can still remember that on my first field trip, I saw a wild wading flamingo for the first time. Her bright pink stood out in the sun-bleached landscape of Camargue, and she made me laugh with her long dancing legs. Flamingos are naturally white. They color themselves pink by converting carotenoid from microalgae with their digestive enzymes into their own dyes. The more pink, the more attractive they find each other. They become on average over 70 years of age and have multiple partners throughout their lives. They do not mate every year, and it takes place when it rains. In the Camargue region, breeding happens on a special constructed artificial island. Actually, you should not view flamingos individually, but socially. They're herd animals, just like the bulls here. The ecologists of Tour de Valas investigate flamingos' socialities and characteristics of individual birds, such as personality and behavioral types, and the role of individual decision-making process within the group. What is amazing is that flamingos are often engaged in the same activities at the same time, including mating and breeding. Those that have observed flamingos for a long time can read the patterns of these types of social behaviors and tell you what time of day it is based on what movement will be going on. Fascinating. I see huge potential in settling a program between designers and environmental scientists, and how design could potentially bring this knowledge out in production and everyday life. So this was what I said when I started.
I think the Tour de Valas is a very famous a research center of biology, basically.
Yeah, it's an ecological research center. Yeah, that is based in the Camargue, and as they study birds and plants, and these birds live not only in Camargue but also elsewhere. They're connected to other places and other ecological research centers. And
I've already found out things about flamingos I didn't know, and I've lived here for 20 years, and I pass them quite frequently. But there's some amazing things going on. But just maybe we could go on to the next picture, because the salt, which began with that first visit, and before we move, the picture of the people standing, are those salt pans, those big white squares? In the first image on the left, which looks like it's been cultivated in some way.
Yes, exactly. It's the industrial landscape, which the flamingos took as their home. So many different stories that are now like thematics and fields of research within Atelier Luma come together in this landscape, because the salt goes together with certain algae species, which is also a living material that Atelier Luma works with. And yes, the salt pans. I mean, meanwhile, after studying for 5 years this material and how crystallization worked with different technologies, one of the, let's say, processes that were developed at Atelier Luma were these kind of crystallized crystal tiles, salt crystal tiles. And those.
So this would be the next picture, which I've.
It's the next picture, yeah.
So what we're looking at there is what, 5 years later, after that first visit with the architects to the salt landscape and the flamingos. Is it about 5 years? Do you remember before what we're looking at now is a kind of a product that came out of this exploration of salt as a material. Am I right?
Yeah, so on the left, you see a plaster mixed with salt, which gives well, it's less use of concrete, and it gives, at the same time, the salt gives, makes it a very dynamic wall panel. And on the right, you see pure salt, which is crystallized on a mesh in a metal frame. It's completely made by nature, and it's yeah, we developed not only this product, but also the kind of crystallization station that we placed directly in the salins in Camargue. So there, these materials grow by themselves.
But if I'm right, you didn't go to the Camargue 5 years before and say, we're going to make some tiles for buildings. You went to look at the landscape and to explore what are you seeing. So there's a journey through all these different possibilities.
Yeah, we went very fast.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's still like a lot more possibilities to discover and to develop. But I think like having the site in Arles of the Luma Foundation and this like architecture of Frank Gehry, which just opened this summer, pushed us towards to develop architectural applications. And yeah, so this became a focus, but of course there are many more possibilities with salt. I mean, salt has a antimicrobial feature, so we are now developing antibacterial door handles, for instance, from it, and other, yeah, there are many more possibilities. And at the same time, the crystallization, it can be used for tiles that form a wall cladding. But this knowledge that we develop now on crystallization, we like to share this also with others. So we develop a software like simulation program at this moment, and it is meant also to be shared in the arts, design, and architecture community, so that others can, like in more complex forms than a tile shape, but also 3D, that you can know how to work with this material that is, yeah, it's abundant. It's a material we have enough of, so it's interesting to see what yeah, how we can relate to it in a different way than we did in the past.
So when you got there, you weren't thinking about a product, but then you presumably went and found different kinds of experts step by step along the way. So did you have to find a crystallization expert?
I started
Expert?
no, indeed, I started searching for people so I found materials and practices, crafts, things in the Camargue, and then I started looking for designers that had already somehow a practice that linked to these materials in the Camargue. So in this project was started together with a Dutch designer that developed not a crystallization process, but another kind of process with salt. And so he yeah, he made the first, let's say, investigation. And then Frank Gehry, in this case, he was interested in yeah, integrating salt in the building, and Maya Hofman, of course, to see if that was possible. And then we organized a kind of a workshop in which we invited several designers to develop a sample. And one sample was chosen, which was the sample of Carlijn Siebel, who's also a Dutch designer. It's not only Dutch designers, but obviously, like at that time, my network was also more Dutch. So we, with the team of HC Luma that installed itself in 2018, together with Carlijn, this crystallization process was developed. And on the left, it's an Camargue-based alternative to concrete expert. So it's a designer that works with all kind of plasters and concrete alternatives. And he, as part of HC Luma, developed these boards that you see on the left.
Let's move on, because I'm looking to a picture of plants grown, burning in a field. Okay. Tell me about what am I looking at there?
Apart from doing a lot of field work, I also spend a lot of time looking at the landscape from above. And with Camargue, you see immediately that a big part is riziculture, so rice agriculture. And even though it's forbidden, and like in many parts of the world, the rice straw after harvest is burned, which is an activity which is really not healthy for the land, for the soil, but also not for the air, for people. So this was clearly for me one of the things that I wanted HC Luma to work with, to kind of question this, or not even question, but kind of find alternatives for this unhealthy behavior. And behavioral change is always a very hard thing, because one thing is finding an alternative, like as a new ecosystem or a new like material solution, but then actually have people to change. That is
but they've been growing rice in the Camargue for hundreds of years, right, in different ways. So there are generations of practice, and so you come along and say, well, we need to do it differently. That presumably is not such an easy conversation. Did the farmers were the farmers very welcoming to your invitation to discuss alternatives to burning?
Well, farmers are always meant as a group, but they're not all equal, of course. So you have to find the right one. There were very different kinds of farmers, like the big ones, small ones. Very few biological, organic farming. There was one farmer that used geese to take away the weeds in his fields. So I thought already, that might be someone that is in for some experimentation or some, as he already took a very alternative position in the.
But the important point here is that people like me say all the time, you must go and work with farmers, you must work with local people who have a lot of knowledge. But it's easy to say that, but the practice is, do you go and knock on their door and say, hi, I'm a designer? Yeah. How do you make that first contact with a farmer about, for example, a project about rice burning? Do you kind of just go and say hello, or do you get introductions from local people?
Well, in Camargue, that was a very particular thing, of course, because of the project of the Luma Foundation having such an impact on the region. So I couldn't do as I normally would do, like immediately just go there, like not, like engaging in a very open and impulsive way, just improvising and like, yeah, starting to work on a on a trust relationship. But so that was an extra challenge in Camargue. So first it was important to understand their also political position towards the project of Luma. So to know, yeah, and to talk with everyone, basically, to not miss out. So to really talk with many farmers, and then, but in this case of the rice, the Hoffman family, they already did some projects to work with rice farmers, so which were not focused on design, but more on new rice species, for instance, that are healthier or use less water, etc. But yeah, I think what was also an interesting moment is a game we did once with the rice farmers, where we laid out basically the process, the seasons, and what does it mean, like a year of rice farming, and then we had them to point out where actually the problems were, and for them. And that was when I figured out that actually the pumping costs for the water were a huge problem for them. And yeah, so there were, I think, yeah, we created different formats of interaction, and these different formats brought different information. And
So the other thing I can imagine looking at that picture of the rice is that people have had this discussion all over the world, and how do you figure out where you can get the story so far? What experiments other people have done? Are there like rice burning research centers or agricultural centers? Who knows about this stuff that you can talk to?
yeah, that's a very good question. I've looked into Japan. I've talked with some institutions in Japan that deal with not basically with rice farming, but with the rice culture in a broader sense. And it did not happen so far, but the idea was also to create an exchange um, with other places on rice farming. I've looked also in the Mediterranean, in Egypt and Valencia, how rice farming, what they do there with the material, how the culture is, what products they have, how their economy is, which also it gives always a good reflection.
So I'm
Yeah.
just thinking aloud as you speak about, so you're looking to Japan for institutes of rice culture and in Egypt for different traditions. So this is a long way from the traditional design research, which would mainly perhaps just be about the materials or something. But let's go on to the next picture, because is this rice? There's a picture of people with a gigantic rope. So tell me what I'm looking at there.
This is a moment in the project May Your Rice Never Burn, which I directed in collaboration with the landscape architect Estelle Julien, and two weavers from Spain. It's a collective. They're called Baliki Popoi, and it was so it was basically on finding other ways for to deal with rice straw. So it was a project that like followed the rice growth through the year. So it started with a hand harvest, because the way rice is harvested in Camargue is then the rice straw gets completely cut up, and we wanted to use it for weaving in this case. And so yeah, first the hand harvest, and then there were several weaving workshops, because this project was not only to find a solution, but really a kind of conversation piece. So in the working with the material and in the transmission of weaving techniques, different people came together. So both the farmers, environmentalists, residents from Salin Giraud, designers, people from the network of Luma. So these different people came together to discuss basically two problems. One, of the rice straw, and the other one was, again, I mentioned it before, the rising sea level and the situation of the dunal landscape in Camargue. And as weaving often happens in small objects, I wanted to avoid also this cheesiness of the that weaving can sometimes have, and do it on a large scale. So
Is that a rope that you would use in a ship or something? What am I looking at there?
yeah, it's this is the oh God, now I forget the name. Not Chihuahua, that's a dog. But
Right.
it's close to that.
You can tell me later or put it on as a subtitle.
It comes from Japan, where Shimenawa, where this is still practiced, where they make this beautiful, huge, giant ropes, which is part of the rice harvest, basically. And but the rope can also, when placed in the right way, can also help a dune to form. So it's not too like it's with a baby dune, and you can create a larger dune or help the dune with putting big ropes here and there. So this was one of the prototypes we tested, but we also made other ones, more like fences and big flat rope structures.
It's just fantastic. There are so many projects around the world of people rediscovering ways of making hedges, dunes, canals, in other words, using natural materials to retrofit borders and barriers, because nature needs these liminal sort of connecting bits. So that so that's a landscape project as well as a rope project.
Yeah, but there were different motivations for people to use, like to join in this project. Some came for the crafts, the farmers, of course, because it was their material, the environmentalists because they wanted to do something good, like etc. But yeah, it was extremely fun to do, and yeah, I think.
So you, Henrietta, this is where one of the key things of this conversation is we're talking about farmers who grow rice and have excess rice. We have environmentalists who want to look after the sand dunes. We have crafts people who have weaving techniques and other disciplines. But you are the person who brings those different groups together. Am I right? So you and then you help them get on with each other and give them a task and frame their activities. Okay. Good. I'm just trying to see regenerative design when you're dealing with a place with this unique history and the unique materials and the unique skills and the kind of cultures, but at the same time it's very local and to that place. But then you go from Japan and Spain, you bring in skills and
yeah, I think that's something that was really part of the success so far, I think, of the atelier, is this combination of bringing together foreign or outside expert or international expertise with very local knowledge of place, and species are everywhere different. Yeah.
So, well, we can maybe come back to that subject in a bit, but let's go on to the next image, which is the village. And I've seen this before. So tell us what we're looking at here.
Yeah, this is a drawing of the weaving ecosystem of Zanfiromilis, which is, or it's a proposal in a way.
Which country are we in now?
And well,
We're in Sardinia.
Zanfiromilis, yeah, so Zanfiromilis is in the west, yeah, the Gulf of Oristano in the west of Sardinia, which is the least touristic, and it's a wetland, and yeah, it has this particular village has a very interesting weaving craft, which is now only practiced by the very old women of this place, and that yeah, the knowing realizing the value of this craft and the risk of it to disappear made Wetland Preservation Foundation invite me and Atje Luma to come there and to yeah, first of all archive or catalog this craft, and then come with the proposal how this craft could be revitalized, because this foundation really acknowledged that the human relation with the wetland through this craft was very important, a very important part to preserve this wetland nature, which is very vital for the island of Sardinia. And yeah, of course, it doesn't make sense to only focus on objects if you want to revitalize that craft. It's also important that young craftsmen can live somewhere, or that you can, if you start a residency, that there are other things also. Well, I call it here the distributed hotel, but like you need not only to host the makers but also the collectors. Like it's a whole like ecosystem around the craft, apart from
So, but we can. I'll put a link for people, because it's quite a long and detailed story. But it began with would you catalogue these kind of skills before they disappear? But then you meet with presumably other groups of people who are doing the ecological restoration of the wetlands or preservation, and somebody else doing economic development. Yeah. So you have different groups. So, but what this village kind of image here is these different activities beginning to interact with each other. Is that a correct way to read it?
I don't know, like if there's a correct way to read.
Well, let me ask this question again. So, what you see here is a kind of a process of different activities through a kind of a settlement, and you could see that as learning activities, tourism activities, weaving activities, ecological restoration activities, etc. You know, all these different things going on. So have they kind of connected to each other automatically or spontaneously, or is it your job to say you should meet each other, introduce people to each other who are doing connected things in the same region?
Yeah, I think this is something that is always part of the work I do. But it's also, I mean, in the beginning, the work was to catalog the existing objects, so to kind of identify the classics. So what are the objects that are part of that? So really to kind of pure out the tradition, and then to research actually what plants are part of this. And a lot of this knowledge was quite hard to find, because and especially on small islands, in small villages, people just tell you things because they think you like to hear them. So it's not necessarily true. So you need this takes a lot of time. this was one thing. And then I did also together with some people from other people from Atiluma and some other designers, we did some tests with actually how long things take, because one problem is that this technique takes very long. So how can you help? How can design like a mold, for instance, help them to speed up their process, etc. But also how which craftsman can experiment, or you can rely on, or you can still work with, which ones are can do a transmission to younger people, and to really understand how you could work. So not only understand the tradition and the objects, and to relate objects that over the years became decorative to the contemporary way of life and contemporary work, because since there are not so many fish anymore, fish traps, this doesn't make
So
much
this
sense.
this kind of weaving community was associated with the fishing community. So there were the two activities. And how long did it go back? A long way. These kind of overlapping practices of fishing and weaving. Did they have a long history?
Oh yes, it's like 7,000 years.
Oh right. Okay.
Really,
So
it's super old.
yeah.
So it's also sad that it functioned for such a time. And then in the 60s, with when plastic came in, there was it was disturbed, of course, because ricotta baskets, because they don't only make fish traps but also ricotta baskets, they were made much quicker and cheaper from plastics.
But okay, so we had a kind of 50-year pause whilst we killed the world with plastics, but that's kind of, we have to stop that now. What we're looking at here is not just production of artifacts, but also schools, hotels, tourism, and so on.
Absolutely.
So there's different.
So there were many, there were different design researchers, you could say, or activities going on in parallel. So at the same time I was studying and working on the objects, the Wetland Preservation Foundation studied how to breed wild wetland nature, you could say, like how to breed these specific plants, because the problem is not only the plastic, but also that the wetland nature is endangered. So in a way, like it's if you weave, it means also you need to grow the plants you weave it, or whatever you do with it. That and at the same time, we developed a kind of weaver house. So to give a place, a physical place in the village dedicated to weaving and the learning of weaving, so a school. So that was also a project.
So I know that your kind of interest is expanding, and I presume there's a lot of different wetland cultures and traditions just in the Mediterranean, and then the whole world is filled with different wetlands communities. How do you think, looking forward, you're going to connect these different projects? Because lots of people are beginning to do work on restoration with a social as well as an ecological aspect. Is there an existing network of wetland restorers or wetland regenerators, or are you going to have to invent that community from scratch?
No, they're there, and they're quite well organized. There are different organizations, but I really believe that design can give an other dimension to that, to the work. And I believe that it's important, because it's otherwise the animals and plants get too much isolated, or it's only, let's say, ecologist, plants and animals, but that's not the world. So yeah, I think
Well, we're
also
trying to
often,
replace. Yeah, we're trying to replace a world in which people would come along and build a marina or hotels or tourist resorts, and then restoration has these many different aspects. But that's what I find so fascinating, that we're just beginning a journey called how do we bring the nature back? How do we bring livelihoods back? And do so in a way which is fair to the people who already live there, fair to the nature that's already there. So I guess there's a lot of learning to be done with very, very different disciplines, I would say.
yeah.
Let's go to the next and final project, which I think is going to be an exciting moment. So what we're looking at here is Henrietta Waal, the brewer. Tell me what we're
Well,
looking at.
it's not me, but
No, tell us the story, what we're looking at.
yeah, so here we look, we're back in the Netherlands, so not in France anymore, on an island in the very north, in the North Sea. It's a very small island with about 1,000 inhabitants, and it's a brewery. As you can see on the left picture, there's some solar panels on the roof, and then on another picture you see the inside, and then above that you see not me, but another brewer who yeah who's tasting some June berries in the dunes of Vlieland. It's a project I'm was still connected to, and it came out of yeah, a kind of ritual that I installed with that island. I went there for many years to brew beers with the landscape, because it's very particular and important nature for the Netherlands. It's also wetlands, mudflats, and yeah, I have this project for many years in which I brew with landscapes, and it's very interesting to really taste, and another experience to taste a landscape in a beer. And what is really great in this case is that my project was embraced by two men. One is Bojan, the brewer here, and the other one was a guy with quite some money. And they said, like, yeah, they would they wanted to sustain this practice that I had, and to develop it further into an economically viable product. So yeah, the brewery is now called Fortuna. That's a whole other story how that name came about, but it brews with natural dune water, so it has its own source. Because basically these islands are large water filters, and the water has a very particular taste, which was until the 80s the let's say the neutral taste for all people living on the island, before the Dutch government obliged them to install also on the island the kind of national water taste. But still, so the water now on the island tastes like everywhere else in the Netherlands, but in the beer you can still yeah, you can still taste the place. And
But I'm fascinated because it looks like a large, rather empty island. There's enough plants there to create beer with the taste of the island. It's not the volumes are not big, but it is now economically sustainable. The brewery, it can support itself with.
yeah, it is. It gives water or it gives water. It gives beer to all the pubs on the island, and it really produces for the island mainly. there's yeah, there's one place in Amsterdam that sells it because there's a big link with the city of Amsterdam and people that visit the island. But for the rest, everything stays on the island. Yeah.
So it explained, just because this is about regenerative design. So in what ways were your design skills helpful when you were developing this brewery project? What did you design? What was the design part of it?
So I well, I did design the first like floor plan for the brewery. And I kept I kept on doing artistic direction. So we worked with a local architect that wanted to at first install a kind of how can I say? A friend of mine called it a Monsanto factory because it really looked like not the like the wood that it has now, the outside skin. It fits much better in the landscape. It's more soft, and even though the brewery is on the edge of the little industrial zone on the island, it's like this. It's better integrated. But then it goes basically. I do right now. I do consulting for every kind of design thing the brewery does. But also there's of course the design of the beer and how the beer can tell different stories about the landscape. So it's not only the taste of the beer, but for instance also in the past there were storytellings about the movement of the islands because the islands are a very dynamic waterscape in a way. And to remember this history and how which parts of the islands were lost to the sea, very dramatic stories were invented. But right now this practice is lost because we look on satellites and everything became more rational and mathematic. But by connecting again these stories to the beer, so you can scan the story on a code on the beers, this is a way also to preserve this kind of heritage on the island. And
so it's just a very nice. It's a nice way to connect with what is unique about the island. It's geology, it's water, it's plants, and I don't think anybody watching this needs a lot of help to appreciate beer, but it's just. I wanted to come back about the time frame. So you didn't just go there and make a brewery. We're talking about years of learning about the place, meeting people, learning about the plants, the water, and so on. So there's a certain amount of time needed just to get acclimatized to all these different qualities. Am I right?
Yeah, and especially also working with yeast is very fascinating. It was for me the first time that I work with an invisible living species. So that makes you aware that there's a lot more than the visible world that affects affects us and the ecosystem. So beer was basically the beginning of biochemical processes and all those things that are also in Atiluma very important, bacteria, algae, whatever. Yeah.
I'll put a link because it's incredible, the number of stories with the algae lab at the Atelier Luma and all these different materials, and it's just very inspiring to hear you explain that we're talking about 5 or 6 years with Atelier Luma, but also your longer career and work weaving these different aspects of a place together, the human and the social and the ecological. Is just wonderful. I suppose that I wanted to conclude our conversation with Yeah, if you maybe one of these projects, if you had to start it again, would you do it differently? Because I think it's always interesting to know, what people learn from doing these interesting and wonderful projects, what they learn along the way, so that with the next cycle, have you got examples that you could share of doing it differently next time?
Um, yeah, I find it a super interesting question, and I think um, there's one main thing that comes up, and that is keeping a diary,
Ah,
because I think uh, yeah, in the end, still in this world, products or results get a lot of attention, and I think, and especially for me, and where my interest and talent lies, it's just very important to keep a very good diary, and maybe some also like a visual diary. So, but also writing and drawing. So I realize I need to uh, do that more obsessed than I did, because it goes like in waves. Yeah.
I was just talking last week to an English designer called Daniel Weil, who I first met 30 or 40 years ago when he was starting out, and he's had exactly the same comment. It's something in the air that he thinks that his diaries, I have to say, without making you feel bad, has kept a diary, a visual diary every day for 35 years.
Oh wow.
Yeah, it's incredible. And he says,
Yeah.
it's only interesting to me. I said, I don't know how you share it, but I think it just sounds just very valuable. Yeah, a practice. Never mind whether you have to share it or not, but just a different way of knowing. And there's a whole group of people doing nature journaling who are not, scientists, but in lockdown, people have been drawing weeds that they live with, or drawing insects, or drawing pictures of moss on the balcony of their apartment. And it's incredible how much the diary keeping and journaling is another word that people use. Yeah, it seems to give people incredible, meaningful experience, which they hadn't done before. So I'm thrilled that you should mention it. I don't, of course. I have all sorts of boring words, but yeah, it's nothing is ever too late. Henrietta, I want to thank you for this, for your time and for your work, and for being such an inspiring presence in our world, and a great example of what regenerative design, if we want to use those words, is about. And maybe we can meet you in another few months. We'll talk about fermentation or keeping a diary, and keep on the conversation.
Oh yeah. I mean, 5 slides on fermentation, it's nothing. I can talk about it very long. Yeah.
We'll do that. It's been wonderful, and
Yeah.
thank
Thank
you
you.
so much. We'll speak again soon. Okay.
Thank you.